So over the last few weeks I've been following the Japanese situation closely, and I've done that because I've had a long-standing interest in nuclear power, seeing it as a real solution to moving away from fossil fuels. So my position is at the university as an academic. I study climate change and the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. So I've got no skin in the game here. I don't really mind what energy systems win or lose, as long as non-fossil fuel systems actually eventually work. I don't get paid by a wind power company or a uranium industry company. There's no nuclear industry that pays me. I'm just an independent thinking academic who's trying to nut through these issues and come up with something that's practical and realistic. And really, from looking at the science and engineering of nuclear power, it must be a really important part of our future energy mix. I'm convinced of that. It depends in the context. In the context of the Australian debate, we were just edging to the point where we were debating about having a debate. You know, we weren't really there yet. If you think about it like a pot simmering on a kettle, it was just starting to come up to the boil, and it's probably the gas has turned down and we're back down to simmer again, and it will stay that way for the next few years. But the drivers for having nuclear power and having these alternative technologies available that can seriously supplant coal and gas haven't gone away. And the fact that Australia is still committed to reducing its carbon emissions and continuing to do so right through to a 60% or more cut by 2050 means we can't just dismiss it. It's going to stay there, hovering in the background, waiting for someone to take the energy issue seriously again. So politically, it's just easier for major parties to avoid talking seriously about it, but that won't stay the same way. And crunch time is going to come, I think, within the next 5 years, certainly within the next 10, when we've got to replace our ageing coal-fired infrastructure and upgrade our transmission systems. And the options really are going to be to build the next fleet of coal-fired power stations that will themselves last another 50 years, or else to build a lot more gas and then be subject to the vagaries of the gas price, remembering that gas is going to be an increasingly useful commodity as oil production declines and gas is used as a substitute. So if we're generating our baseload electricity from gas, electricity prices are going to rise. So we've got that problem with gas, we've got the problem of replacing coal. We have renewable energy systems that we're trying to deploy on a large scale, and I certainly hope they can scale up and take a fair bit of the slack. But as far as I can see, there's still big gaps there, and those gaps are not going to go away, and that's what nuclear really has to fill. So the pot's simmering on the stove again, and just a few things will cause it to go back up onto the boil. Still unclear, still serious situation, and I'd love to say that the situation is locked down. It's not fully locked down yet. I mean, if you look at the circumstances that led to this, it was a cascade of problems that resulted from what's turned out to be a 14-metre tsunami slamming into that power station. The tsunami was concentrated in that part of the coastline. So there were 4 power plants operating at the time, 11 reactors in total, and the other 3 power plants are all safe in lockdown now, but Fukushima Daiichi still isn't. 2 of the 6 reactors are now in cold shutdown, but the other 4, either the spent fuel pools or the reactors, are still in trouble. They have got external power to the site now, and that should help them restore their emergency cooling systems. If they can do all that, then I suspect within the next week we should know if the situation can be fully locked down. I'm confident, but quietly confident, that that will happen, thanks in a large part to the great efforts of the engineers and fire department and so forth, who've been trying to face this overwhelmingly difficult problem caused by what the insurance industry would call an act of God. It's full fury vented against this particular power plant. It's an interesting issue to explore. One thing that hasn't often come out is that Japan gets almost all its energy from 3 sources. It gets it from nuclear power, coal power and gas. And there was a petroleum refinery in Tokyo that got slammed by the earthquake, and a number of extremely large explosions in habited areas that burnt for a week, spread pollution all around the local area, killed dozens of people. the other energy technology that Japan relies upon killed lots of people. The nuclear power station hasn't. It's just not as sexy a story as this insidious radiation coming out of this power plant. But Japan's options are extremely limited. They've got coal, which they've got to import, they've got gas, which they've got to import, or they've got uranium fuel that they've got to import. And the one that requires the least amount of imports is uranium. They currently get about a third of their electricity from uranium, and the plans still are, and this was announced by a Japanese minister just today, are to continue to push that towards about 50% by 2030. So it's not as though the Japanese have got an option. They can pursue small amounts of wind and solar, but Japan's got 120 million people concentrated in a small set of islands. There's not that many renewable resources to depend upon, let alone to have the capacity to store energy, to cover intermittency, and to do something heroically bold in terms of renewable energy that no other country has ever achieved before. The only way countries have achieved energy independence using renewable energy is to build lots of large dams, and there's only a few countries that can do that, like Norway. Both China and India have an ambitious nuclear program, and for climate's sake, one would hope that that continues to flourish and displaces more and more coal. I mean, China still gets around 75% of its electricity from coal, and that reality is not going away soon. But the best hope of displacing it is to have large amounts of nuclear power and wind and solar and whatever else China can muster. The sort of nuclear power plants they're building in China today are obviously the latest technology. And I say that in the context of Japan, that Japan are also building the latest technology now, but the reactor that was hit by that 14-metre wave was the first generation technology designed in the mid-1960s, and that plant opened in 1971, so it's 40-year-old technology. It's still pretty robust to stand up against a very large earthquake and tsunami, but we've made a lot of improvements, further improvements in passive safety systems and protection of the plant against these natural disasters in the last 40 years, and they're the ones being incorporated into the designs being built in China and India today. Well, the media love a good story. I mean, that's the bottom line, and a melting down power plant leaking radiation is a great scare story to run on the headlines. The problem has been that the media has conflated the practical reality of what's going on with a lot of hype and scare stories. They've even had headlines in newspapers where in the same title they've talked about the nuclear meltdown and 10,000 people killed, confusing the issue from the fact that the 10,000, now perhaps 20,000 people were actually killed by that giant wave and the earthquake, and no one's been killed by the nuclear power station. But it makes a great Godzilla-like story when you can put the two of them together. So the media will always be the media. They will always do this sort of thing. But I think the public become hardened against scare stories in the end when the apocalypse never materialises. So although it seems ironic right now that a crisis like that which has occurred in Japan could be good for the nuclear industry, it could, because it could make, for one, people more aware of how the technology actually works, more aware of the alternatives that are available. A bit of self-education never hurt anyone, and if you can be motivated to do it, then crises like that can often motivate people to understand technology better. I've often been accused, especially recently, of pushing some agenda with nuclear power and being anti-renewables, and clearly it's not the case. I'm not anti-renewables, I'm just pro-practical solutions. And what I argue vehemently against is those environmentalists who say, guys, climate change is the biggest problem the world faces. We must do something about it. We must put on a carbon price. We must encourage, put all these incentives in place. We must close down coal-fired power stations. Oh, and we can't have nuclear power, thank you very much. What I'm saying is climate change is a really serious issue. We must put a price on carbon. We must close down our coal-fired power stations. And to do that, we must use all of the tools available to us. And that includes nuclear power, it includes wind, solar, geothermal, wave, energy efficiency, the whole caboodle. And if we get it in the right mix, we get them all competing on a level playing field where really the best technologies can win, then that's the situation I want to see. But I don't want to see good solutions like nuclear power ruled out on silly ideological grounds, and that's where I see a lot of the debate being polarised. And I think organisations like the ACF and World Wildlife Fund and so on do great work in the field of biodiversity conservation and are frankly appalling when it comes to energy policy.